Our Yom Kippur afternoon continues with a panel discussion. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to begin by introducing our moderator, someone who's well known to the entire Temple Micah community, and we'll go from there. Jodi Enda, our moderator for this afternoon, is an award-winning journalist and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. She moved to Washington in 1993 as a national correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer and covered the White House, Congress, and presidential campaigns. In 2016, she edited CNN's first ever campaign book. Most recently, she served as editor-in-chief of Think Progress, a progressive news site. Jodi is known to us at Micah in more ways that I can mention here. She is, to name just a few, a Shabbat regular, past editor of our newsletter, The Vine, a former board member, past president of the congregation, and simply a highly respected voice and leader in our Micah community. I asked her to moderate this panel for us this afternoon because simply I knew there was no one better anywhere. I will turn things over to Jodi now to introduce our other panelists, who I will simply say honor us all by being with us. Thank you, Alice and David. Jodi, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rabbi Zemel. I'm not quite sure how to follow that. That was touching. But I have the honor of introducing the two other panelists who will be joining us in this discussion, and I think you'll all be blown away by their experiences and the depth of their knowledge. Alice Greenwald is the president and CEO of the National September 11th Memorial and Museum at the World Trade Center in New York. Alice has worked for the memorial since 2006 and essentially helped create it. Previously, she served as Associate Director for Museum Programs at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she also was a member of the design team for the permanent exhibition. Before that, she was Executive Director of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia and had leading roles at numerous other museums. Thanks for being with us, Alice.
Thank you, Jodi.
David Skorton, a cardiologist, is the president and CEO of the Association of American Medical Colleges, which represents medical schools, teaching hospitals, and health systems. Previously, he was the 13th Secretary of the Smithsonian, president of Cornell University, and president of the University of Iowa. He also served on President Biden's transition team for the arts and humanities. I think those experiences alone make him something of a Renaissance man. And yet my favorite tidbit about David, which he did not include in the biography that he sent me, is that he has played the flute in concerts starring Wynton Marsalis and Billy Joel. I'm angling for an introduction. In reading their biographies, I realized that Rabbi Zemel might have had another reason for inviting these two luminaries. Both have advanced degrees from Chicago area universities. David earned his BA and his MD from Northwestern, and Alice has a master's in the history of religions from the University of Chicago Divinity Schools. So let's hear what they have to say. I'm going to start with Rabbi Zemel. You approached me and our two other experts with one basic question. How should we remember COVID? I think it's safe to say we were each a bit confused about what you meant and why we would talk about this now while the pandemic is still raging. After some thought and discussion, we've come to the conclusion that this is another example of your unique and confounding brand of genius. You think about 10 steps ahead of the rest of us. So maybe you could explain to everyone why you were thinking about memorializing a pandemic that is not yet over and what you hope to achieve.
Well, first I'll say thank you all for being here. Alice and David, just thank you for everything. And Jodi, always. In terms of your question, I think my particular brand of genius might be reading books that I grapple to understand, don't fully understand, and the questions that I'm asking of myself as I read the books stay with me and haunt me. So in thinking about this, and I don't want to take too long to answer this question, but maybe since this kind of opens up the conversation, I will take a couple of minutes. Many years ago, I read fairly close to each other two books that I keep near me all the time, kind of on the top of a messy pile or in a place. Eric Kandel's book, In Search of Memory, and Avishai Margalit's book, The Ethics of Memory. And in talking once with Larry Hoffman about these two books, he said to me, "You're really interested in memory." And later on, for an essay I wrote that was published in one of his books, I wrote a sentence something like, each one of us really is the way our memories, the way we act in the world is the way our memories inform and define who we are. Eric Kandel's book, In Search of Memory, is the story of this brilliant physician who comes to realize as he's going through his medical career that part of the inner pursuit, the inner drive of his medical career is that he's never been able to go back to visit his earliest childhood memories in Vienna when his family ran from the Nazis shortly after the Anschluss, when he was 7 or 8 years old. And he would recurrently kind of think about his bedroom, the apartment, toys that he kind of had to run away from and never got to go back to visit. And so he lived his life, he realized, kind of in search of memory, and the memories continued to inform him. Avishai Margalit's book, The Ethics of Memory, realizes that his career as a philosopher is in part driven by the parents who raised him, both Holocaust survivors, one of whom talked about it with certain frequency, and the other one who kept it not suppressed, but she never verbalized, never talked about it, didn't want to make it part of family conversation. So he says he grew up as if kind of between two worlds of shared memory, and he came to realize living in Israel that the ethics of memory is a constant kind of conversation, an underlying fabric of the entire society. Is so much of the society of his generation are people with the horrid memories, the painful memories of the Shoah and that period of Europe, and beyond. Growing up in a country that's a country of refugees, and the memories that you can't go back to or can go back to. So I saw this kind of connection between the Eric Kandel book and the Avishai Margalit book. But I came to realize that it's the way we remember what we try not to remember so much informs who we are. And so trying to transfer this to COVID, I was wondering for myself, when someday the world will open up for myself, and we've kind of had fits and starts, am I going to want to run back and forget this? Who am I going to be more like? What voice in me is the louder voice in terms of Avishai Margalit's parents, or in terms of this kind of ongoing experience that he grew up with in Israel, and in terms of Eric Kandel remembers what he can't remember, so to speak. And this year has been unlike any other year, where of the over 365 days, there were so many days I never left the four walls of my home. And even in doing that, as I saw in the newspaper and television, so many peaks of the outside world, how lucky I was in the safety and security and comfort of the four walls of my home, the room that I'm sitting in, compared to virtually the entire rest of the world. And I thought, how am I going to process this? It felt morally wrong to me to simply go back to business as usual when the world has suffered so much, when so much has been revealed, when so many people died. And I wanted to know, what do we do? And I also kind of thought, being a rabbi, putting on my rabbi hat a little bit, if we don't begin to think about how to ritualize this now, the moment can be so easily lost, because the clock is always ticking. Life is always moving forward. Unless we pause to stop and begin to think about creating a ritual, knowing that the ritual we create in the moment is not going to be the final ritual. It may be a mistaken ritual, but unless we assume that obligation from very, very, very early, it can so easily fade into a distant part of the rearview mirror. So that's why I thought this Yom Kippur, Yom HaZikaron, the day where we set aside part of the service for all of our personal memories, maybe this would be a moment for us to try and pivot, at least as Temple Micah, to begin to take a look over our shoulders, even as we remain surrounded by what we are all living through. I hope in some way that was a semi-coherent response to your question.
Yes. So Alice, you have been instrumental in memorializing two of the major events of the last 100 years. What is the goal of memorialization?
Well, I think it's a wonderful question, and I've thought a great deal about it, and I think it's actually very much in line with the questions we've just heard from Rabbi Zemel, which is that in the books I've read that have really moved me along these lines of questioning, there is a lot of writing by a professor out at the Claremont McKenna schools by the name of John K. Roth. And John writes a lot about the ethics of memory, interestingly enough, uses the same terms. And where he lands is that memory is actually the prerequisite for moral conscience. And he goes on to cite Elie Wiesel, who made the statement, if we stop remembering, we stop being. That hit me like a ton of bricks when I read that line, because if you think about the human experience of loss of memory, people with Alzheimer's, they become somewhat diminished as human beings. If you extend that to the communal sense of memory, we become a diminished society if we don't remember where we've come from. And that's the risk. I believe, and I think Rabbi Zemel would agree, that remembering is a very Jewish idea. It's actually a commandment. You know, when the Israelites are given a set of ethical precepts to make them coagulate into a community, remembrance is a commandment. You know, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So it's not just something incidental that we have the ability to do, it's critical. And if you think about the Seder as the quintessential ritual of remembrance in Jewish tradition, what are we doing when we have the same meal, the same words, the same gathering, the same family stories, the same matzah bowl, so year after year after year after year after century after millennia? What is that about? And yes, it's about a recitation of history, but more importantly, you are gathering the youngest members of the tribe and inculcating a sense of ethical imperative. What is the ethical imperative? We talk about enslavement and, freedom and being brought out of slavery with this promise of a covenanted community, this promise of a future. But it is to move from the history to the ethical consequence of what you are remembering. And the ethical consequence of what you are remembering goes like this, and I'm not going to recite it exactly right, but everyone should think of themselves as if they had come out of Egypt, right? We are experiencing slavery in the ritual itself. Why? Because we should not oppress the stranger, because we were strangers ourselves. There is an ethical consequence and obligation of memory in the act of remembering the story of where we've come from. All of which is to say that I believe we have to remember even the most difficult, perhaps most especially the most difficult parts of our human history in order to know where we need to go as human beings. It's about being the best human beings we can be. That's why memory is essential. And it could be a personal journey, remembering your ancestors, remembering, like Eric Kandel, where we've come from, to know where we're going. And I think critically, it's a communal obligation to remember, because when we don't remember, we run into great difficulties in the present that only go on to impact the future.
Thank you. That is fascinating, and that leads me into something that I wanted to ask David, because clearly, I'm not sure we've been our best selves during this pandemic, or at least the society as a whole maybe has not been its best self during this pandemic. And I'm wondering if memorializing our current situation can prevent or at least diminish a future pandemic, or would it even have made a difference if we had, if our predecessors had memorialized the 1918 pandemic, for instance? David, speaking as both a humanitarian and a physician, can you address that?
Well, thanks a lot, Jodi, and thanks, Rabbi and Alice, for such moving comments that I just learned a lot about. I'll tell you, there's a lot of things about the COVID experience that I paradoxically have woken up in the middle of the night thinking, I wish I could forget this or that thing. The image of someone dying in an intensive care unit where a nurse or a physician is holding up a smartphone to them to say goodbye to their family because the family cannot be there. And the pain of that moment, from everyone's point of view, from the point of view of the person who is leaving us, from the point of view of the caregiver, and certainly from the point of view of the family, these are things that are painful to remember. And yet, as Alice brought out and as the Rabbi brought out, we need to remember. Why do we need to remember? We need to remember, as you're bringing out, Jodi, so that we can learn something from even the most painful experiences. In fact, perhaps most importantly from the most painful experiences. And I don't know, I'm certainly not smart enough, not wise enough to know all the things we might have done differently. But I do know that as we go through our lives in the scientific sphere, we sometimes make the mistake of not remembering that science alone, and remember, I've spent my life basically in science, that science alone cannot solve our thorniest problems. So think about the 20 years of basic research in medical schools and labs around the country that led to this phenomenon called mRNA vaccines, a certain way of making a vaccine that allow us to do that successfully in less than a year. And yet science will not help the person who is hesitant to take that vaccine. And therefore we have to turn to something different. And that's why the Rabbi's usual wisdom is shining so strongly today on Yom HaZikaron. And that is today, as we're remembering, let's remember that we need a broad range of human experience to deal with the broad range of memories that we're taking out of COVID. We need science, that's for sure. We also need the arts and humanities. And I feel a little bit funny talking about this in the presence of Alice Greenwald, one of the great professionals in the world of museums and museum studies. But I would say that one of the strengths of museums writ large is that they help us to understand our memories to some extent and understand the memories of others. And if we don't know how to do both, remember our own memories and somehow tap into the sensibilities of others, we will not learn what we need to learn from this ongoing, very, very unsettling time. And I'd like to think a little tiny bit about artists, whether they are visual artists or musical performers or poets or authors. They will tend sometimes, won't they, to perceive changes or trends in society before the rest of us, before me for sure. And that's why they're sometimes controversial, because they're perceiving a trend that we don't all perceive. And as I followed the literature of poetry and painting during the pandemic, we've seen people who have early on begun to point out the enormous health disparities that were there for hundreds of years in this country, but were brought out in such stark relief during COVID. And so we need to remember our own experiences, our own memories, and tap into the thinking of others, that latter largely through the arts and humanities and not through science.
Both of you have brought up so many things that I want to ask about, and we only have so much time. So I'm going to plow through, and please interrupt and say whatever you want, because you're both so enlightening. So Alice, we've been talking about a museum. I don't know if it's realistic to create a museum to the pandemic, or if it would be helpful. But is there a way to envision such a thing, and to envision a museum that actually would help generations going forward? And if so, what would you put in it? How would you configure it?
Well, I think that's a very challenging question, Jodi, and I'm going to answer it by actually speaking to what David just spoke about, which is I think you're absolutely right, David, that people who create art are plugging into something at a different level than the rest of us. And what we respond to in art is that human connection. What is missing at the moment in the way we are, not missing entirely, but what seems to be absent in general in society at this moment, is the kind of intense and active empathy that is at the heart of great artistic production. We live in a time, I believe, when empathy has been suppressed in favor of some, I think, a distorted idea of personal freedom. The point of a museum of memory, like the 9/11 Memorial Museum and the US Holocaust Museum, is that it invites you into history, into a story, but through the personal experience of people who witnessed it. And if the museum is successful, it invites you to see yourself in that story, whether it happened to you or not. I'm going to repeat what I said before. Each of us has to feel as if we were on the exodus out of Egypt. Each of us, whether we were there or not, to understand the Holocaust, needs to feel as if it happened to someone in our family or happened to us. To understand 9/11, which was witnessed by 2 billion people on the same day 20 years ago, an unprecedented moment of collective global witness. What we saw in the immediate aftermath, not long-lived, unfortunately, but in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, was this outpouring of empathy, caring about one another, wanting to volunteer, wanting to provide some kind of service to others, compassion, shared grief. We saw ourselves in that story, whether we lost someone or not. These were people just like us. If there is to be a museum for COVID, the question would be, what kind of stories do you tell in that museum? And the story that David just mentioned of the excruciating isolation of dying without one's family nearby, the extraordinary generosity of spirit of the medical workers, the nurses who sat with people dying in lieu of their families. Immediately, that story draws me in. I can imagine being in the position as the person who is facing death, the nurse or the medical professional who is doing the role of family, the sense of deprivation and loss that the family members are feeling by not being able to be with their loved one. To look through a window and put your hand on a window to touch, not even to touch, but to try to connect to your loved one. I mean, those stories about COVID bring you in at a level of empathy that perhaps changes the way we think about how we care for one another. These are very difficult topics. I think telling in a museum, telling the story of the science that led us to find a vaccine in a nanosecond is extraordinary. That should be told because, there's a human part to that incredible intellectual effort of solving a problem, even before you know what the problem is you're solving. I love that part of the story. The story of people who cheered people on, very similar to 9/11, the 7 p.m. clapping. These are stories that invite the public in to understand what happened. And, you know, I had said to Jodi in a conversation a few weeks ago that, you know, I had parents who were much older than the parents of my peers. My dad was born in 1904, my mom in 1913. They were both old enough to know about the 1918 pandemic. I never heard about it. They never talked about it. They talked about a lot about World War II. They talked about the Holocaust. They talked about World War I in passing fashion. They talked a lot about the Depression. I never heard about the Spanish flu. And it makes me wonder why that is. You know, I have an 8-year-old grandson. Last year was probably a year he will never forget. I mean, being home, having to learn on, you know, your laptop. I mean, not being with friends. This was a difficult year for that child. It will, in many ways, impact the rest of his life. I worry about, as a grandma, you know, worry about that. It's impossible for me to imagine that he won't share those stories. And yet, what was it about our parents and 1918 that didn't enter the conversation? And maybe, you know, maybe it's because those stories weren't told enough for people to feel they were part of that story. I don't know, that may be one of the reasons. So long way around to answering your question, Jodi, which is that I think a museum can be built around any idea. I really do. I'm a museum person, of course we can. But it's how you approach the telling of history. Is it the facts and the data and the specifics and the, you know, all of the stuff that you need to learn when we say, you know, you must have a historical consciousness? Or is it really the human experience of history that's what connects us? And I think if we are to build a museum about COVID, it has to be a storytelling environment that allows people to learn the empathy that perhaps we have lost touch with at this moment.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And Rabbi Zemel, you know, we've talked about some heart-wrenching things that have happened during the pandemic, particularly involving death and the inability of people to gather and be together with their loved ones during a very painful time, and also some moments of community, like as Alice mentioned, New Yorkers, you know, gathering at 7 p.m. on their balconies and on street corners and banging pots and pans to honor medical workers and other heroes, essential workers. When you and I talked about this panel, you said that you would like to use the pandemic and the memory of it to reset the table of our civic culture. And I'm wondering if that is what you're talking about, or what exactly you hope to accomplish, and what do you mean by that?
I've learned to never say anything that sounds fancy to Jodi Enda, because she'll write it down and remember it. So in terms of resetting our civic culture, I think we probably all worry about our civic culture as American citizens. I think I've been worrying about it for a long time, where American holidays have become 3-day weekends, an opportunity to go shopping, to get a mattress on sale. And this diminishes our civic culture. And so what I said to you is, if we could find a way to, I think there's an understanding, at least among us, that we need to re-energize our shared civic culture in order to recreate a shared American story that we all feel that we have a stake in, and a recreated American story requires, the way I think about things, rituals and moments that we all connect to, and perhaps a way to start is COVID. If we could figure out a way to begin to memorialize COVID in a way that you're never going to reach everybody, but touch communities across the country, large and small, with different kinds of memorials or moments of honor outside of community hospitals, community medical centers, medical schools. I mean, most towns, many towns have places that are known where the medical care is given or received. If we could find a way to do that, because but even beyond that, because it wasn't just the hospitals where this was happening. Every fire station, in terms of the firemen being so prominent, the firefighters being so prominent on 9/11, but every place that has an ambulance that carried someone from one place to another that was sick with COVID, every first responder, if we could find a way across the country in communities to, on a certain day, a certain time, memorialize the way 7 o'clock every evening became the pots and pans moment in New York City. Because there are certainly things that we agree on, that there was loss, that there was courage, that there was sacrifice. If we could begin there and knit something together that would touch many people, then that could be a first step towards finding a way to recreate a larger and knit together a larger, thicker civic culture, sense of civic responsibility and civic engagement and American civil religion, to use that term. I love the way Alice talked about the Passover Seder, describing the Passover Seder as, not to use a term that I've just kind of made up, the way Alice described the Passover Seder, every Jewish home around the world creates a pop-up museum for the moment of Passover. That's what it is, where we tell a story, we share the Jewish story writ large. Once we were slaves, now we are free. If we could find a way as Americans to take a step where there could be a kind of pop-up museum in communities across the country on a given day, I like to think that enough people would feel good about that they would want that to continue. I mean, I think all I have to do is try and make people feel good about something, give people a taste of something that they feel good about, and then to want to do it again. So that's the beginning of my thinking about this, Jodi.
Jodi, I have a thought to add to this wonderful exchange that Alice and the Rabbi just had. So for those who have had the experience, and I hope everyone will at least think about the chance of having the experience of visiting one of the amazing museums that Alice has led, what you're seeing, if Alice would agree, is the last mile of the process. What you're not seeing is the original decision of a curator or a researcher to tackle a story or a problem, and the behind the scenes research that goes on, not for an hour, but for weeks or months or years, for major exhibits, years. And then the last mile is what you find out when you walk in there. And so that whole thing starts, in my view, with the self-reflection of a researcher or a curator who decides to take on a story. And to bring this back, Rabbi, to where we are today on Yom HaZikaron, we're in the last mile of a process that each one of us had to do, a self-reflection, to decide to be a part of the Micah community. And on this particular day, on Yom Kippur, to be a part of the contemplation and the self-reflection. And so I think that each one of us needs to develop our own museum of the Holocaust by starting where all tackling a big problem start, and that's with self-reflection. Each one of us has been affected quite differently by COVID. Some happily not affected very much at all. Family was safe, friends were safe. But of course we were affected, as the rabbi said, by working from home and by the upending of our society. Others were affected in horrendous ways. But I believe just like we come to the synagogue, hopefully, with some self-reflection. And just like that curator or researcher starts off in a museum with a self-reflection about a problem or a story to tell, or an artist or a novelist or a biomedical researcher, I think the beginning is a museum of the self, a museum of the soul, to do self-reflection on what COVID has meant to us, and then to somehow bring together what might turn out to be something that would help us, Rabbi, tikkun olam, about our civic culture, which needs it so badly. And I want to give one example of where we need that. And one thing I really hope we focus on in our great museums, in our home conversations over dinner, in our synagogues and churches and mosques, and that is to think about the so-called social determinants of health that have been again laid bare by this COVID pandemic. And when you think about what affects the health of a person, we think a lot about people like me in white coats with stethoscopes around our necks. And it turns out that all that health care, as wonderful as it is responsible for maybe 20% of what affects our health. And the largest single piece, once you get past genetics, are social determinants of health. The environment one lives in. Do you have access to food, to water, access to running water, which we take for granted in many aspects of our society, in many parts of our city? And so the question I guess I would ask is, do we have the time to develop a museum of the soul, of the self, where we think about the social determinants of health, the deep, deep medical correlate of tikkun olam? And the last mile could be what the rabbi is suggesting, or perhaps a great museum person like Alice will decide to do an exhibit or even a whole museum, who knows? But the first step on this journey is the self-reflection. And I would invite each of us today on Yom Kippur, as we are reflecting on our last year and our year to come, to reflect back on COVID, what it meant to us, and develop a museum of the self, a museum of the soul.
These are very high-minded discussions. And as the journalist in the group, I need to bring us down a little bit to some of the problems in our society now that I think we need to address, and maybe bring us back down to earth just for a few minutes, and then we can get back to the high-minded stuff. But we've talked about a little bit about what went on during the pandemic and how people reacted to it, and how our society is really torn on this. And I think one of the more disturbing things that we've witnessed this past year and a half has been the distrust in science and medicine that we've seen from a large quarter of our population. And I'm wondering, David, in particular, what we need to do to reestablish trust in science and medicine. And I know that's not just an issue for scientists and medical professionals. It's got to be something that includes everyone, but what do we do?
Well, this is a real problem, and I want to tell you, I take the first responsibility on the shoulders of the science and medical community. That we tend to talk in jargon, we tend to be at times impatient, and that we need to find a way to communicate with people in a way that's not threatening, that's not judgmental, about how science works and why it might be reasonable to trust the science. Just exhorting people to trust science is not going to work. It's not going to work. And when we think about something like hesitancy to take the vaccine, which is a problem that's right in our face right now in the health care community, in the health policy community, and the public health community, I can't blame the communities. I can't blame the individuals. We have not done, Jodi, a good enough job. And forgive me, the media has maybe not helped us do quite a good enough job to find out how to get across to people who don't trust the systems that we've developed, whether those systems are the systems for gaining information, the systems for gaining healthcare, whatever. I take the responsibility that for the problem you have eloquently brought up, squarely on the backs of the science community. And I'll tell you what we're doing in the organization that I'm part of now. And I don't take any credit at all for this. It's done through the brilliance of some of my colleagues at the AAMC. And that is, we're trying to work with communities and listen to communities and understand where they're coming from, and not interacting with communities to, quote, educate them, which can be taken as a very insulting term. You know, maybe I don't need to be educated. Maybe I don't believe in what you're doing, sir or madam. But to listen to what they are thinking, to what they are feeling, to how they are hurting, and to take from them the wisdom and the guidance to somehow find a way to get across. How many of us have heard that in communities across the United States, some of the most trusted people in those communities, certainly healthcare professionals, are highly trusted, but maybe some of the most trusted people are people who are running faith-based organizations, clergy, rabbis, imams, whatever, pastors. Some may be other people in a community who have gained gravitas through long life and good deeds. We need to listen to them and ask them the question that you're asking me, and not presume, because some of us walk around with multiple letters after our name, that we know how to do this. And so I think it's very important, as a first step toward reaching each other, for us to drop our anger at those who doubt what we're saying and find a way to listen to the root underlying precursors to their doubts. And depending on the group that we're talking about, there may be very, very good reasons to distrust the medical system. And you all know the reasons that I'm referring to. And I think that's the thing we need to do. We need to be humble. We need to listen. We need to gain from the wisdom of our patients, our families, our communities, rather than assume that we have all the answers. And we have to start off by changing our approach from the science and medical side. And happily, there's a lot of leaders around the country who are doing this more and more successfully in their own communities. And I'm optimistic that we will eventually move in that direction.
Another problem that was laid bare during the pandemic, something that's existed forever in this country, which is the gross inequities and inequalities in our society. COVID hit Black, Latino, and Native American communities particularly hard, and Asian Americans were targets of bigotry and hatred. And then during the pandemic, a police officer killed George Floyd, and protesters filled our streets, and white supremacists and white nationalists came further out of the woodwork than they had been in the previous few years. So once the pandemic is in the rearview mirror, can we somehow use it to help our society address these kinds of overarching problems? I'm sort of throwing this out there to anyone who wants to answer it. Does anyone want to take that one? Otherwise, I'm going to pick on someone.
I'll start, but I certainly don't have a comprehensive answer. You know, we do live in a time of extreme societal fracture, polarization, lack of a sense of connection to one another, and perhaps more importantly, lack of a sense of responsibility to each other. And I'm speaking in the broadest possible terms. Obviously, on individual levels, there are people who are magnificent in terms of self-sacrifice and, you know, caring about causes larger than themselves. But there is this moment that we're in that is particularly fraught. And to follow up on something David said earlier, you know, I actually believe that memorials and museums and moments like Yom Kippur are the containers in which we're invited to self-reflect. In other words, you go to the museum to be asked to reflect more deeply on what actually matters, whether you're getting that in conversation with a work of art or in a storytelling environment like a Holocaust museum or a museum about 9/11. And we do need to reflect on those things in order to get where you want us to go, Jodi, which is to say, you know, why is it we live in a moment that is so fractured? Why is it we are looking at a pandemic, which is, you know, it doesn't pay attention to your political affiliation, it doesn't pay attention to the color of your skin, it doesn't pay attention to social inequities, which are obviously very real. It's an equal opportunity killer. And why are we not approaching an equal opportunity killer as a collective and say, this is our enemy. This is our challenge together. It's not that person's challenge because they happen to have gotten sick, or that person's challenge because they happen to not have access to medical care. It is a universal challenge, and we're not looking at it through that lens, and we're not doing what Rabbi Zemel has asked for, which I think is so right, which is to take a moment collectively and stop in our tracks and say, we're going to have a moment of silence as a nation, as a global community. On this day, at this time, wherever you are, just stop. Think about the millions of people that have gotten sick, the numbers of people in your community who have died. We just owe them a minute. We owe them a minute of our time and build a sense of network and community and connection in the gesture of stopping and paying attention. I think ultimately, we can't solve all the problems. There are just too many of them. But you take small steps in the direction of reminding people that they don't live by themselves. They live with others. And that by virtue of living in community, whether that's a local, national, or global community, that you sometimes just have to pay attention to the fact that we're all in it together. And maybe that moves the needle on these other issues somehow.
I think, Jodi, I think what Alice said is great wisdom, and I think it's important to move in that direction. And if Alice would take a friendly amendment, I would say not only the idea of a generally observed moment of remembrance, moment of recognition, moment of identification with the process, but also asking people in communities, how would they like to see this done? Because another wonderful, wonderful earmark of a great museum, like the ones that Alice leads and has led, is to be responsive to the people that they are serving. And so one of the things that I think we need to do, which all you have to do is drive by in Wisconsin Avenue and see the beautiful banner outside of Temple Micah that the rabbis and others have had up for a long time, with some sort of general rules about thinking beyond ourselves. Find out how that message can be gotten across in individual areas. And, our country is famously decentralized. It's one of the great strengths of the United States. It's also one of the reasons that the United States is tough. And that is that there isn't really one monolithic culture. We're increasingly diverse, as the recent census has just taught us. We're getting more and more diverse in ways that, I wouldn't have thought about 10 years ago. And so to think about how to adapt what Alice just said in a global sense to the local, I think would be a way to win both sides of this. So great idea, Alice. I love it.
Rabbi Zemel, would you like to weigh in on this? And I guess I would add one other question to that, which is, what have we learned in the past year and a half about so-called American exceptionalism?
Small questions, Jodi.
I like to save the small ones for you.
Well, I'll add to what Alice and David just said. When you ask that question about the extensive divisions in the country, if I was asked to try to respond to that, I would probably get together a group much like the people on the screen. I would ask a group of artists and a group of scientists to talk to me, because what I sense, and it's beyond what you read. I mean, Judge Learned Hand, a great jurist from New York, one of the greatest sentences he ever wrote was, he was asked to write a book and he said, there are too many books. Sometimes I think there are too many pages to the Sunday New York Times with too many analyses of what's going on. I think I sense there's a lot of anger in many parts of the country. And my own belief is that anger sits on top of fear. That anger is a response to fear. And I would want to know, in fear, having once taken a high school biology class, I think fear goes to this primal part of the brain that we learn to protect ourselves instinctively. You know, if I see a bear in the woods, I know to run away instinctively. I don't have to think about it. You know, some people see a bug they don't like in their house, they run away because they're afraid of that. So fear is somehow primal, instinctive, and very deep. And then anger comes to kind of maybe compensate that and push away the fear. I would want to think about how what are people afraid of? People are afraid of change. People are afraid of things that seem to be spinning out of control. I think there are ways to respond to that, both. And I feel like the longer term answers lie more in the artistic side than the scientific side. In order to get at people a feeling that they're in control, that there's a way through the fear to find beauty. I don't know the answer, but I think it's it takes a long-term kind of thinking of a group of smart people on every level, and it's not going to be no matter how smart the people are at the best think tank on Massachusetts Avenue. It's going to be in where we live all across the country, where people will be invited to engage in these kinds of conversations, where they're given space and there's no judgmental finger pointing. But if people are given an opportunity to express their fears that they themselves are unaware of, because it's primal. It takes a while to articulate, to bring it out, and then create a breathing space. I just think what the structures are where communities are empowered and enabled to do that, I don't know. But I think that this has to sort itself through the system. And anything else that comes from the government, so to speak. Well, and I'm in favor of government. I'm in favor of expertise. I'm in favor of everything. But I think it has to be multi-pronged. And I think we have to listen very, very closely and create those spaces on the local level. That's in terms of America exceptionalism. I grew up, I had a wonderful 8th grade teacher, okay? And this is kind of what I learned about what America is. And this is what I love about America. And I have my own version of telling the story. But America is a place where there's an apartment building in a neighborhood in Chicago, and there are 8 or 10 apartments in the building. And everybody in each apartment comes from a different country. Maybe they're a different color. They have a different religion, but they all walk in and out the same front door of the apartment building every day. They put their trash in the same cans, and they don't become best friends, but they live together. They don't want to take guns and shoot each other. For me, that's what America exceptionalism is at its best, that we take all comers. We take all comers and we figure out a way to make it work. And it's bumpy, and there's a lot of misunderstanding. I think that's the kind of American exceptionalism that I love. Not that we get to break all the rules of the world and throw our weight around, but we're exceptional is that our aspiration is, the way I tell the story, I love going to 7-Eleven, where the clerk speaks one language, the person in front of me buying the Slurpee is getting a strawberry Slurpee, he speaks another language, the one behind me is getting a banana Slurpee, he speaks another language, and I'm getting my grape Slurpee, and I speak the language. But you know what? We're all using the same dollar bill to pay for the Slurpee. And so for me, that's American exceptionalism.
Amen, Rabbi, amen.
That is wonderful. And we're almost out of time, but I would like to give David and Alice the opportunity to help us think a little bit more about what Rabbi Zemel said about resetting the table of our civic culture and how that would work. I know, David, you've thought a lot about not only the medical community, but the arts and humanities communities and how they can work together going forward. And I thought perhaps you would like to say something about that and how it might help in terms of this, in terms of what Rabbi Zemel likes to call making progress in the human project.
Well, we sorely need to make progress in the human project, Jodi, that's for sure. But I don't want to despair. We had talked earlier about the Spanish flu, and my dad and the family came over from the Pale of Settlement right in the middle of the Spanish flu. And the ship was loaded with flu. They ended up living in Cuba for 3 years, eventually came to the United States. And my dad, who passed away about four decades ago, used to always tell me that somewhat derivative, really, or similar to what the rabbi just said, that don't ever tell me anything negative about the United States, he used to say to me. They took us in at a time where there was all kinds of reasons not to take us in. People in that boat were loaded with influenza and so on. And the country may not be perfect, but there's ways to go forward. And this is a story that my dad told me. I wasn't there. I don't know. It was storytelling, to get back to a point that Alice was making. So I think we need a combination, Jodi, of the scientific principles, not so much today's scientific finding, but the way science works. And bear with me for a moment as I just remind everybody how science works. So a scientist or a researcher makes an observation. And then in thinking about the observation, she comes up with an idea, what might be responsible for that phenomenon? And that's a so-called hypothesis. And then she looks around and makes some more observations. And if the observations don't match with her postulate, with her hypothesis, she changes the hypothesis. She throws out the hypothesis. She doesn't throw out the observations. And so there's a great lesson from science, is to believe the data that's coming toward us. And we've had some problems believing those data in the country in the last year and a half. And then on the arts and humanities side, as we talked about earlier, that observing a phenomena, I think, happens very, very early, before society in general recognizes certain things. And don't artists and novelists and poets and so on also develop a hypothesis, a way to tell that story, a way to get across the emotion? So I think there's many more commonalities than differences. And the mistake that we make in this technological age is thinking that we only need the STEM disciplines, and I'm a STEM guy, that we only need the STEM disciplines. We need the breadth of everything knowledge and wisdom can teach us to deal with a problem like COVID, which has scientific aspects, humanitarian aspects, cultural aspects, political aspects. We have to think broadly. So I hope that the kids who are thinking of going to college, who may be with the congregation today, and the parents of those kids, think about the importance of a broad education. Think about the importance of drinking deeply from these different wells of knowledge. And no less an observer of the scene than Albert Einstein coined this phrase, branches from the same tree, in an essay in the 30s, where he talked about all arts, science, and religions are branches from the same tree, sort of a tree of knowledge. I think about that phrase, branches from the same tree, all the time. I believe that's the only way that we're going to get past the major problems that we have, Jodi.
Thank you. Alice, would you care to add to that?
Well, first of all, I think you just heard the words of a true humanist. It's no wonder that, David, that you ended up as Secretary of the Smithsonian, because there are many ways of knowing in the world. And, you're speaking about the different channels into enlightenment, if you will. And we all have to follow the path that is most meaningful for each of us. It may not be the same path, but hopefully there's that wonderful story. And I'm not sure I've got it exactly right. I think it may have come from Stephen Hawking, where he talked about the scientist and the Buddhist climbing a mountain, and one is on one side of the mountain and the other is on the other side of the mountain. And they're both struggling to get to the top. And when they get to the top, they find each other. That there are different ways to get to the same place. But I think I will simply answer your question, Jodi. And before I do, I just want to thank Rabbi Zemel for the privilege of being part of this conversation on a day that is so significant in terms of personal reflection and personal responsibility. And to just go straight back to the Pirkei Avot, we're not going to perfect the world overnight. There are many imperfections. There always have been. We live in a time of great fracture, as I said, and if you can put one piece together with another piece, maybe that's enough. But there's that wonderful phrase from the Pirkei Avot about, it's not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you are not free to desist from trying. And I think today is a day of trying, and every day should be a day of trying.
Well, this has been extraordinary and very enlightening. I want to thank each of you. And I know that Rabbi Zemel would like a few minutes to wrap things up. So I will turn things over to you.
First, I'll say my word of thanks. It's nice to feel every once in a while. What I rarely feel is that I'm right about something. I was right that Jodi should be the moderator for this panel because your questions were just spot on. And I feel right that, of course, Alice Greenwald and David Skorton should be people that we learn from. I frequently say it's a privilege. It is such an overwhelming privilege and humbling to be a rabbi at Temple Micah. And I remember when I met Alice years ago when you came to live in Washington during your stint at the museum. And I'm so glad that we've kept in touch. So thank you so much for joining us from New York. And I look forward to my next time seeing you face to face. And David, thank you so much. You bring so much to our community in your time with us. So thank you all so much. I'm going to end as we're going to be, as we end this conversation, we'll be going back to some of us will be holding real prayer books, some of us will be holding virtual prayer booklets. We're going to be going to our Yisker service. And this has been an hour conversation where we're thinking about memory, we're thinking about Zecher, thinking about how our past can inform who we are in the world and does in fact define who we are in the world. So I'm going to reminisce just for a brief moment about Aaron Alchel, who was a beloved member of our community who died a number of years ago. Aaron was a scientist, a biochemist. He was also a learned and devoted student of Judaism. And Aaron once asked a question of me that I've never known the answer to, but it's one of the questions that I love thinking about. He asked me about himself, what I thought the cumulative effect on his life has been that he set aside 1 year every day to sit in a synagogue on Yom Kippur, fast, and just try and take stock of himself. And he did that from the time he was a little boy, as he became an adult, and then an older adult, and he eventually passed away. And late in life, he asked me, what's the cumulative effect of my doing that, trying to figure out who I am as a person? And then he said one more thing about that. When we talked about that, and we spent some time over many conversations talking about that, kind of chewing on your life and remembering the past. And then he said, what do you think the cumulative effect on the Jewish people has been of doing that? The Jews for generations have sat together and have considered their lives, considered the lives of their families, considered the lives of the Jewish people, considered the lives of humanity's march through history on a day together. What is the cumulative effect of a people, of a religion that does that? There is, of course, no answer to that question, but I think it's a question like that that challenges and empowers us to consider who we are in the deepest sense of the word. And as we enter Yizkor, to take time to think about those people that have had the most profound impact on us, whose lives have touched us, the people that created us, the people that formed us, our teachers. And that's made it all the more privileged to sit with, on this screen, 3 such learned teachers who contribute so much to the world. So thank you all so much for giving so much of who you are to people you know and to people that you don't know. It's a real, real gift.
We are gifts and we are blessings. We are history in song. We are hope and we are healing. We are learning to be strong. We are words and we are stories. We are pictures of the past. We are carriers of wisdom, not the first and not the last. Ledor vador nagid god lecha. Ledor vador we protect this chain from generation to generation. Ledor vador these lips will praise your name. Looking back on the journey that we carried in our hearts, from the shadow of the mountain to the waters that would part. We are blessed and we are holy. We are children of your way, and the words that bring us meaning, we will have the strength to say. Ledor vador nagid god lecha. Ledor vador we protect this chain from generation to generation. Ledor vador these lips will praise your name. These lips will praise your name.
Thank you for this wonderful, wonderful hour.